All right, everyone. Hello to everyone who's joining us today. I see a couple of people are moving into the webinar. It's great to see that so many of you logged on so early already. Thank you so much for joining. Warm welcome from my side. My name is Lisa Ramershoven. I'm an advisor for the GIZ Fabric team. And while we're just waiting for a couple more people to join this call, thank you already for all of those who are already here today. I myself am located in Phnom Penh at the moment, so either whether you're similarly close in Asia or based in Europe, good morning or good afternoon, maybe already good evening for one or two of you. Today we are having our Moving the Needle, Creating the Future Together webinar, number 16 already. And today we'll be looking at the puzzle of due diligence, a detailed look at individual accountability. And I'm really grateful to share this experience with all of you. I see we have a really good turn up of people in the session today. Today we've invited a mix of speakers to join us, more from like a legislative background, more from a practical background. And so we're hoping to get a good mix for all of you and get the questions that you brought to today's session answered. I will introduce them individually when the time comes up. So thank you everyone for joining today, both to other participants and also to our 5 speakers today. I'm saying 5, which probably sounds like a lot at first, but the way we structure today's call is that we'll do a panel discussion with 3 of our speakers at first, and then we've invited 2 additional participants for a pitch towards the second half of the session, because we really wanted to give everyone the opportunity to have a maybe more practical outlook where you can get some support and guidance on the topic as well. So hopefully those will be some people that you will can ask follow-up questions to if we don't manage to answer all of your questions in the session today. If any questions come up now while you listen to our first half of speakers, or if any questions come up later, you're always welcome to post them in the chat. If you already have a specific person in mind that you want to address this question to, then also put that in there. While I'm obviously trying to listen to our speakers giving their answers, I will also keep a close eye on the chat and then address those questions in my follow-ups. So I would say that's it for housekeeping. I see also the majority of speakers who've signed up, participants who've signed up is here. So I'd say we get started. I think if we look at this topic 2 years ago, at least that was my impression, not many of the people in the region knew that much about the concept of due diligence. And for many, the difference between CSR, ESG, and due diligence remains a little bit vague. However, I think most people have come to notice that one of the key differences in those versions lies in the topic of accountability. And so we've decided that this is one area that we really want to focus on today, especially considering the current legislative changes that we see in individual national legislations, such as Germany or France, and also on a regional level, such as Europe or in the US. In this webinar series, we've covered different due diligence topics in previous webinars before. We had one session on the due diligence laws in Europe and the US. We had a session on the German Supply Chain Act and on due diligence legislation and what that means for purchasing practices. So those will also put the recording to the previous ones in the chat if there is anything you missed. For today, we want to look at sort of an introduction specifically in the accountability topic, as I mentioned. The reason why we do that is that there was a piece written called the Apparel Suppliers Guide, which was initiated by a different group of suppliers, and that was Epic Group, Norlanka, Shahi Exports, Simple Approach, and Transformers Foundations. And as a bottom-up project, they looked at 12 specific legislations that they felt are most important to suppliers. And I found that work to be quite unique in a way because it was done bottom up and it manages to take the often more theoretical knowledge sharing on due diligence to a very practical level. And it also looks at the context, the status, the obligations that arise for suppliers specifically from those 12 pieces of legislations. And it also covers direct and indirect effects, including forms of enforcement. So what we decided to do today is start with today's session, and then we'll follow that up with 3 individual pieces of legislation that they've covered as well. Because in the kickoff of this white paper, those were the areas people were most interested in. So on the 15th of November, we'll also look specifically at the legislation around waste regulation and extended producer responsibility. Then in January, we'll be looking at eco-design for sustainable products. And in February next year, we'll look at modern slavery and the EU legislation and what that brings in terms of challenges for the garment and textile sector. But really that supplier-led white paper is sort of what started this little due diligence mini-series that we now do as part of the Moving the Needle Together. On that note, I think I've talked enough, so I really want to bring in the first of our speakers. So Lena, you're probably, let me start with you. I have a first question for you. And one is you are a lawyer by training. So can you tell us a little bit more about your current role before we start with a thematic discussion? Sorry, Lena, 1 second. You're still on mute. I was just trying to figure out if this is my problem or the other participants also can't hear you.
Sorry, classic.
There we go. Welcome again. Over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and hello, everyone. Yes, you were asking about my role. So actually, my role at GIZ is twofold. So I have now been with GIZ for almost 6 years, and I work in the legal department as senior counsel. But since 3 years, since 2020, I also work in the GIZ project, which is called Public and Private Responsibility for Sustainable Supply Chains. And in this project, we advise BMZ, which is the ministry, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, in all matters regarding corporate responsibility, etc. And of course, for me as a lawyer, at the moment, the focus is very much on the developments on the European level, so for the European directive, but also on the German supply chain law.
Well, that's perfect, because that's also, I think, then going to be thematically my first question is, of the German supply chain law obviously is already in place, but the European one we're talking about right now, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, is not yet. Can you give us a little background on where that stands and who's negotiating what at the moment with whom? And is there already anything we know for sure where the parties agree on, or are there other areas where we're like, okay, we just really got to see until it gets published?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you kind of alluded to that. It's quite a complicated process. So I think maybe it does make sense to do a quick recap in order to better understand who's negotiating with whom. So what happened so far was the whole process started in spring 2021 with a resolution by the European Parliament, which gave recommendations to the Commission on rules or regulations on corporate due diligence and corporate accountability, which the Commission then took into account and developed it into a proposal for an actual directive in spring 2022, which was then followed half a year later by the Council's general approach, which also took its own view on how this directive could look like. And then the latest position that was published was in June this year, the European Parliament's position. So that means that now we have 3 different positions from 3 different EU institutions with 3 different drafts on how this directive could look like. So now we're in the middle of the negotiations between these three institutions, meaning between the Council, the EP, and the Commission. And these negotiations that are going on right now are called the trilogue. And they've been going on since June, since the European Parliament's position was published. And it's an ongoing process. It is planned that the trilogue negotiations should be finished by the end of November. So that means that we will have an agreed upon position then between all those three institutions and have like the ready directive then. However, we do hear some mixed voices from people involved in the negotiations or that are very close to the negotiations. So some say, yes, that's totally feasible. We do hear others that have some doubts and that are a bit concerned that the process might even take a bit longer. We really do hope that the process will be finished at the latest point by March next year, because that's kind of the latest point, because then there will be elections, and that would mean that it doesn't mean that the process would stop, but it would mean that it will be prolonged. And there's new people talking about the directives. There's different parties, and this could mean that it's just like an endless trialogue. So we really do hope that it will be finished within this year, within the Spanish presidency, or at latest until March next year. So much for the process. And then you were also asking about what do we know for sure? So I have to admit, not much. I don't think, or I don't know that there is any like one article that I can say that's already agreed upon. What I can say, however, is that there are some general pillars that all the three positions agree upon. So, for example, also we will talk about this a bit more later when we talk about accountability. But then it is on all three drafts of the directive that there will be a rule on civil liability, for example. It's not clear how this rule will look like, and the drafts differ very much in every draft. However, it is clear that there will be a rule, at least at this current stage. And where the positions differ is, for example, when we look at the scope of application, which also might be interesting here. So the Commission and the Council, for example, propose that the directive should be applicable to all companies that have more than 500 employees, plus a net worldwide turnover of more than 150 million, whereas the European Parliament suggests that these thresholds should be lower, which means that it should be 250 employees and a net worldwide turnover of more than 40 million, which interestingly is just the limit that the European Union determined for when we are talking about a big company and when we are talking about as an SME, a small and medium-sized company. So everything lower than 250 employees and 40 million net worldwide turnover would be determined as an SME, and it should not be applicable, according to the Parliament, to these companies. What they all have in common, furthermore, are that there should be various support measures. For example, financial support for small and medium-sized companies is foreseen that companies should engage in industry schemes and multi-stakeholder initiatives. It is also foreseen that the Commission will publish guidelines in order to help companies fulfill their obligations and to get some guidance on how they can do that, and also some support for reporting requirements. So I think this is like something that all the drafts have in common that we can expect, although nothing is for sure yet.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think as someone who's in contact a lot with the stakeholders here, if it comes to guidance and those kinds of things, that is very much needed. So I'm glad to hear that despite the negotiations, running until November, potentially March next year, and even then, if they can't agree on it, longer due to the elections again, it's good to know that seems to be a bit that everyone can agree on. I'd also like to come back to that question of support measures in a little bit, but before we do that, I want to ask Florian a question. Florian, you're from BAFA in Germany, which I don't know if everyone is already fully aware of, or whether this is one of the many abbreviations the Germans are contributing to the international conversation. So the German supply chain law is in place already. And as an officer at BAFA, it would be great if you can tell us a little bit more of what is the role of BAFA.
Indeed, thank you very much, Lisa, for the invite and for the kind introduction. Great to be with you today. I would say that the Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control is so far only known from exporter side from Germany towards the world. And now, since the beginning of this year, we are also engaged with a certain new task, which is a task not only new to the companies that fall under the German Supply Chain Act, but also new for administration. Our office, Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control, the German abbreviation, as you just pointed out, is BAFA. So whenever you come across BAFA, then it's the same office, but in a German abbreviation. We are entitled with the tasks to control companies that fall under the German Supply Chain Act, which is actually now 1,300 companies roughly in Germany, which is companies that have more than 3,000 employees in Germany. And from next year on, the 1st of January 2024, this number will rise to about something above 5,000 companies, because the threshold is lowering down to 1,000 employees in Germany. But this is very important to say at the very beginning. The law applies to German companies or companies that are doing business in Germany. And from there, it trickles down along the supply chain. What we are not entitled to is doing controls and doing respective measures abroad. We are a German federal office, and we are applying a German law.
Okay, and that is then connected to companies operating in Germany above the threshold you mentioned. Also sounds like the threshold is a bit higher than what's currently planned for the European level. So maybe the definition of a company, a big company versus a big company on the European level are slightly not the same yet. We'll see. Obviously, we heard from Lena that the negotiations on the European level are still continuing and, haven't concluded yet. But you mentioned that the companies that do operate in Germany and that you have the authority to hold accountable. What does this mean? Or more importantly, how do you do this? Assuming there is a complaint, who makes the complaint? How do you hold them accountable? How do you do the control part of what's in your name?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much. So with our teams, which are, we are slightly above 80 colleagues at the moment. When I started in December last year, I've been the employee number 19. So you can see that our office is growing, or our department is growing as well. And we do have a number of colleagues that have control expertise already, because they're coming from public services. But at the same time, there is also colleagues joining from private sector. So we do have a decent mix between knowledge of the supply chain, knowledge of companies, and knowledge of the law, of course. And then we have three types of intervention, basically. One type of intervention is that we do have a complaint mechanism, which is applicable to everybody. At the moment, only 4 languages. We're looking to improve that, but it's Spanish, French, and English and German. You can send in or hand in complaints against companies that might fail to fulfill their obligations under the law. The second area of intervention is reports. Companies that fall under the law are by the law obligated to hand in a report every year. So we expect the first report in the next year, reporting on this year's measures the companies have been taken. And this report is not only for our control, but also will be publicly available to everybody. So the companies that fall under the law are obligated to make those reports publicly available. And then, of course, we expect also the larger interest groups, stakeholders, the larger society to check on those reports as well. And thirdly, we do have the possibility to check on a risk-based approach, which is a general term in the law as well. And on this risk-based approach, we address companies that fall under the law specifically when we get information that there might be a risk of not duly fulfilling the obligations of the law. The obligations firstly address the companies in their own business area, and there the law is the strictest. Secondly, and there the law is rather strict as well, is the first tier supply level. And then, and this is also a term from the law, if companies that fall under the law have substantiated information that there might be a risk of human rights or ecological failure in their supply chain, then they need to act. And in the case of their own business area, they need to act with success, as the law says. And in the further supply chain, they need at least to put efforts in to improve the situation of human rights or the environment in the supply chain.
Okay, so one thing we can say for sure already, it's not really it's a case of one size fits all. Depending on what your individual supply chain looks like, everyone needs to find specific solutions for that. Let me quickly ask you one follow-up that came up in the chat. To clarify, in the case of the German law, we're talking about a law. Well, in the case of Europe, we're talking about a directive, which would then need to get turned into national law by the respective governments that are part of the European Union, yeah?
Yeah, indeed. Lena might be even more expert in this than me, but generally speaking, we have now a German law which applies to Germany. And when we have the European legislation in a form of a directive, which is the approach taken at the moment, it would mean that it will have to be translated or transposed, as the legal frame is, into national law, which means we will see something like 27 AKSG or German Supply Chain Act laws in all the European member states, which need to be at least as strict or as formulated as the directive says, but there might be also some options for the member states to variate or to be even more stricter than the European directive. And this is why it will need to be transposed into national law. And for the German case, it's relatively likely that the German Supply Chain Act will, after the directive on the European level will be approved and adopted, then the German law will be adapted towards the directive and its content.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. Lena, I would ask you the question next. Florian was now talking about the accountability and how BAFA is working on, measuring like what is the risk-based approach there. Then there needs to be a public reporting piece to it. Do we already know anything about what the European Union is planning for the see as triple D, because obviously there also needs, we're talking about accountability in today's session, so there also needs to be a follow-up on that. Would that be part of, like he said, what was it, transposing, right? When it gets turned into national law? Or is this something that we already know a little bit about from the conversation between the tripartite dialogue on the EU level?
Yes, thank you. It is something that we do know a little bit about already, but as Florian correctly said, it's a directive and as opposed to a regulation. So the EU has two different instruments how to pass a law. So the regulation is applicable directly in the member states, whereas the directive, as you explained, has to be transposed into national law. So the member states do have some leeway on how they will transpose that directive into national law, which also applies to the accountability measures, of course. But maybe just first to take a little bit of step back and to say, okay, I think there's two different ways on how to define what we understand under accountability. So I think there's first like the more narrow understanding where we could say, okay, what are the measures that the member states will then be able to implement in order to hold the companies accountable for the violation of their due diligence obligations. So for that more narrow understanding, the first and I think most important thing that's also a novelty that I already mentioned is, excuse me, is the introduction of a civil liability. So that means that in future, people at the beginning of the supply chains that are negatively affected by the violation of a due diligence obligation of a European company that falls under the scope of the directive, and that where that person maybe has like a harm that results from that violation of due diligence, that person will be able to claim their rights based on the directive or the then transposed law in the respective member state in front of a European court. So that's something that's new. We don't have that yet in any member state due diligence legislation. So it was discussed for the German Supply Chain Act, but in the end, it wasn't included. So I think that's one very important pillar of the directive, how companies will be held accountable for violations of due diligence. And then there's another pillar in that respect, which it goes into the direction what Florian already explained. So the directive also says that all the member states shall establish supervisory authorities, so similar to BAFA. And these supervisory authorities in the respective member states will have certain powers, for example, to request information or carry out investigations regarding the compliance with the obligations, or also to order companies to provide remediation and to impose penalties. However, in this directive, it's not regulated how these penalties will look like. This will be something that will be up to the member states. It is discussed if there should be some like framework for the penalties, but in the end, it will be up to the member states to determine the specific penalties. Another measure that is being discussed that was included, I think, in the EP and the Commission draft, which was not included in the Council draft, was that also companies could be excluded from public procurement contracts once they, for example, received a penalty similar to the German supply chain law, or that they might be excluded from receiving public support. But as I mentioned earlier, so we don't really know if that is happening, if this will be part of the negotiations or it won't be part of the final directive. So far for the more narrow understanding of accountability, I think these are like the very important measures by the member states. And then if we apply a more wider understanding, at least for my definition, I would say that being held accountable can also mean, actually, I think the whole directive goes in that direction, right? So the companies should be accountable for their business model and for their acts that violate due diligence obligations and that result, for example, in human rights violations. But then just to pick out like some of the parts of the directive that I think fit this wider understanding of accountability, would be also that under the directive, the companies do have to file a report on the fulfillment of their due diligence obligations, which has to be published then. And then, especially in the European Parliament draft, the stakeholder engagement part is very, there's a big focus on it, that the companies really have to engage in implementing their due diligence obligations with the respective potentially affected stakeholders on the ground. There will also pretty surely be a complaints and notification mechanism. And the EP also suggests the obligation to implement sustainable purchasing practices. And then all the drafts have in common that, of course, the companies then have to provide remediation if a damage has been proven.
Okay, that sounds like a very extensive list of incentives you would assume for companies to really make those changes. You know, some are being maybe more indirect, like when you have a certain reporting implication, that might mean that there's changes in future investment into the company, depending on which information is publicly available. Engaging the different stakeholder groups obviously becomes more important if you have the case of civil liability, and those stakeholder groups which are affected have better options to make that known and to stand up for those impacts. And then also, I think we know from long work in the textile and garment sector that complaints mechanism and like access to remedy have been challenges for a long time. So I'm really hoping that the incentives to prove that in order to really fulfill the requirement of a risk-based approach and make sure that those risks are reduced as much as possible will be something that promotes access to remedy as well as complaint mechanisms. And when we talk about these incentives, though, one thing that comes to mind for me is one thing that's happened a lot in the past is that a lot of these measures obviously come with a certain financial consequence to whoever implements them. And that then means that that financial responsibility or the reporting responsibility needs to be covered by someone. And from what you've been saying, my understanding is that that's something that lies with those directly affected by the laws, which are the companies based in Germany, based in Europe, that have that turnover, that have that number of employees. But Florian, I think many suppliers, for example, have been saying in the past, like we've been constantly audited, but there was little added value after a certain amount of audits in terms of what the benefits those would bring, but the financial burden and the reporting burden in the past, when we had that purely maybe more CSR-driven approach rather than due diligence approach, has been with the suppliers in the supply chain rather than with those who are making those requirements. Now, my understanding is the current changes mean there is more requirements towards those companies based in Germany, the companies based in Europe. So do you see a risk that holding brands accountable will add to the financial burden or the reporting burden for other stakeholders further down in the supply chain? Or are there specific measures that you look for when you have a complaint, etc., that prevent people from passing that on along the supply chain?
Thanks a lot, Lisa. This is a very important question. And of course, the companies that fall under the law, as we, as the control agency, we are in a learning process. And we also accept that the companies are in a learning process. At the same time, we do not want to have the implementation of the act being just a ticking in the box exercise. So far, we don't see any auditing system that is covering all perspectives of the law and all obligations of the law. So some audits, some measures that have been taken, some licenses might be pointing in the right direction. So where we and our colleagues that do the actual control see that there have been measures already taken, but at the same time, we expect the companies to take the law serious and to implement also, for example, a risk analysis system, which is new and cannot, as far as we know from our experience right now, cannot be covered by measures that have been taken 2 or 3 years ago. So what we expect the companies to do is duly applying the law and, of course, assessing the risks that they have in their respective supply chain, which is a general risk that might come with a sector or a specific region they work with, but also a specific risk when it comes to their specific supply chain and their supply line. How do they do this? Of course, they use data, and they use data that they already have in their procurement teams, which has not been used in the past, but now they need to use it. Firstly, and secondly, of course, they need to get more transparency in their supply chain. And to our surprise, there has been little transparency in the supply chain so far. And if there is one positive outcome of the law until today, there is a larger transparency for companies that fall under the law in their supply chain. And of course, when there is transparency, then of course, the possibility to act is a lot higher, which means on the supplier side, of course, companies you supply to will ask you certain questions and to get more transparency. At the same time, the law, the German law, is specific in to whom it applies to, and the German Parliament has been very strict in that, and this is why we also focus on those companies that fall under the law and are above the threshold, which means that we are also very strict when we see processes that might lead to an overburden in the supply chain. So to take the responsibilities you have been given by a law for the brands in this case, and then tickling down towards the supply chain. So we will always check if the companies that fall under the law will do a risk assessment and not transferring the risk assessment need towards the companies in the supply chain. And we also not only covering German SME, but also, of course, relevant to companies worldwide. We also have been publishing a guideline which explains a bit more our approach towards how cooperation in the supply chain would look like to fulfill the law. As I said, transparency is important, and of course, asking questions towards the supply chain is a need to fulfill the law. At the same time, and there is also another guideline on effectiveness and appropriateness, where we would always expect a measure not to be successful if it's an overburden to a company in the supply line, which on the other side, on the brand side, which would always pose the need to take a cooperative approach and check how a specific measure, preventive measure, can be taken in cooperation between the brand and the supplier, and not overburden the supplier, because then it would mean that the measure is neither appropriate nor effective.
I'm hoping that's a little calming to hear for many of the people that we work with on a very regular basis. You will also find in the chat the guidance that Florian was just mentioning. I remember when it first came out that many people got very excited about it because it specifically stated, you know, those expectations of just handing it down to the next party in line doesn't make it necessarily effective. And that's something that needs to be checked for, and then overburdening takes that effectiveness away. So appropriate and effective when it comes to both the risk-based approach, like sector-specific approach, or supply chain-specific approach, really need to be maintained. Thank you for that, Florian. I would also like to bring our third speaker onto the panel, Saj. Please join me. I've asked a lot of questions already about the German supply chain law and then about the European one. Now, sadly, the UK has left the European Union. However, that's also why we wanted to invite you here today, because your situation is a little different than maybe from other producers that are based in Bangladesh or producers, suppliers that are based in Vietnam. Because you're the chair of the Apparel and Textile Manufacturer Federation, and you're based in the UK, so your situation is slightly different. Can you tell us a little bit about what ATMF does, and then how you've been following the developments around due diligence when it comes to answering your members' questions?
Hi, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invite, first of all. We in the UK obviously try to be unique by getting out of Brexit. I'm not sure that was a great option. We are, I think, paying for our mistakes as a result. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But one of the things we do as a textile federation is our impact was as a result of all the negativity that we received over the last couple of years through the labor practices of certain manufacturers, and also maybe some of the brands who were asking for pricing that was unrealistic, and that led to some of these practices. So as a textile federation, where we represent the suppliers in a specific region of England, which is the Leicestershire region. We historically are probably the most prominent supply chain for UK and pretty much Europe at one time. We have heritage sort of going back to 200 years. So at one time we used to run with the logo, Leicester closed the world. It wasn't quite true, but we ran with that. And we used to be, I think, the second richest city in Europe as a result. So we have rich history, we have rich heritage, but the only problem now is that we have lost as a result of the change over from quality production, which disappeared to other parts of the world, to fast fashion. When fast fashion came along, it meant we lost some of our product quality. We cut corners, and as a result, we were found out as a city. So what has happened now is we've lost a lot of our businesses here. We still have the full supply chain, and we're trying to do, as ATM, basically go back to our infancy and restart with a focus on product quality. One of the things we've done is that to help these manufacturers by bringing in different universities, so some academic research to see how we can promote different aspects of this. So currently we've involved 4 different universities to look at 4 different things. We're looking at, can I just get my paperwork out? Sorry, I'm not very good at these kind of things. So you've just, we've linked up with De Montfort University to work on university and industry collaboration, providing some of their skills around design, sustainability, and their fabric research. We're also working with Birmingham University to rewrite the textile strategy for the garment supply chain in Leicester, and that involves due diligence. We're also looking at the economic and social aspects of sustainability through Derby University. And then last but not least, we're also looking at Leeds University to create a framework for the industry, specifically based around our reporting and legal requirements. So we, as a federation, we don't have our own directive as such, but we are working with different organizations to help us to reinvent the wheel. One thing I just do want to say is that we have, as a result of this negativity, felt the need to increase our own requirements to fit into the reporting criteria that's now required from EU. Well, I say EU. We're not strictly following EU guidelines. We have our own, but it sort of sits well with what EU are asking for at the moment as well. So.
Yeah, I can imagine that's been a pretty big challenge. I know from other countries as well that, with the changing, with the move towards fast fashion that happened a while ago now changing that back towards fast fashion and having low prices and very fast production cycles in a very competitive sphere is, even you add another level of challenges with the due diligence requirements becoming stronger, as I guess like due diligence requirements getting stronger as they should. But do you feel that there are some lessons learned or something that you've already that you feel that you can share when trying to make that shift?
I think we having had discussions with the brands here. They're also a little uncertain and unwilling to implement some of their due diligence requirements in the UK simply because it's that trade-off between added value and the financial and the reporting burden that's imposing on the textile sector here. What is actually happening is that one, we have the costing element of manufacturing in the UK is always relatively higher than any other part of the world. As a result, a lot of the manufacturers here are now offshoring manufacturing in Tunisia, Morocco, Turkey, and other parts of the world. And the transition has had a huge impact on the local city. So some of the requirements that should have been met already have been delayed. So we are currently transitioning. But what we're doing is that we're trying to find the right balance so that the reporting requirements are met, but the financial burdens as a result are not going to cripple an economy that's already crippled. So we're currently trying to reinvent.
Thank you, Saj. Maybe this is also a question for Lena on a European level. I think usually there's a saying, with great power comes great responsibility, but maybe for the garment and textile sector, it's been more along the lines of with great power comes the great opportunity to hand down financial burdens. And every actor in the supply chain is obviously looking out for themselves, but there have just been a lot of different consequences to that happening, partially being that fast fashion has really not fulfilled the expectations of the consumer markets or the legislators when it comes to due diligence requirements. How can the lawmaking procedure ensure that there isn't a cascading of responsibility for the European sphere? I think Florian already mentioned some of the aspects for the German sphere at the moment.
Yeah, I have to say, in my view, that's a difficult question. When I look at the drafts of the directive, I do think that the directive makes an effort to clarify that the due diligence obligations are in fact obligations of the companies that fall under the scope and cannot be delegated to suppliers. So also on the European level, as Florian mentioned, the accountability measures that we talked about before, of course, then only apply to the companies that fall under the scope. And for example, a supplier cannot be ordered to provide information or remediation by the respective supervisory authority. I think that's clear. But of course, and also the directive states that as a preventive measure, certain obligations will be laid upon the suppliers in the specific contracts, or will be imposed on these suppliers. But I think the directive makes it clear that the EU or the lawmakers expect the companies to engage in a meaningful dialogue with their suppliers, so that in all the drafts, for example, you can see that it is foreseen that model contract clauses shall be developed between the Commission and the member states, and that these model contract clauses, they will be voluntary, of course, but in their development, I think it is important, and only the EP draft states that clearly, that there will be like how they should be framed. Of course, they have to take into account, for example, the specific needs of SMEs, and it is important that they don't result in that transfer of responsibility. So it should always be clear that the ones responsible under the directives are the companies that fall under the scope and not the suppliers. And as Florian said, BAFA just published a guideline just on that, because that's also an important discussion that's going on in Germany right now. Like, how should the contracts look like between the companies that fall under the scope and their suppliers? But it is important, just as in the guidelines that was published by BAFA, to state also, I think, on the European level, that the delegation of responsibility does not mean by any way that the company that delegates the obligation will have fulfilled its due diligence obligations, because the mere delegation will not mean that they have fulfilled their obligations. That's not enough.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And on the topic of model contract clauses, actually, there was also the work of the responsible contracting team recently that published some supplier model contract clauses, which is a combination of clauses that what the suppliers have done in dialogue, thinking, if we want the contracts to allow that fulfillment of due diligence, this is what we would be looking at. Maybe this is a helpful toolkit for a couple of you out there. And it's interesting to see that those sort of, I don't know, maybe they're like best practices or good cases slowly start emerging. And I saw, Florian, you also mentioned, put up your hand. Do you want to add something to this question?
Maybe reflecting on the UK case a bit, what is important to us as a German federal office, and only having the public control system in place in Germany and not the civil liability approach. For us, the reporting in itself is so nobody would have taken a law to just have reports. The reports are just an information source for us duly applying the risk-based approach in the control system. So to switch a bit the perspective, it's not only a bureaucratic burden for the obligated companies, and of course in some ways also for the supply line, but it's also an important source of information, not only for us as a control agency, but also for the wider public, for stakeholders, to hold companies that fall under the law accountable. So in this, the report has its own role, and it's relatively easy. And also in the German debate, we saw that to say that we need less bureaucracy, we need less bureaucratic burden on the companies, which is important. And we, of course, try also to have our process as less bureaucratic and less burdensome as they can be. But at the same time, we need information from the companies, and we need, of course, also information from the supply line to check whether the companies duly apply their obligations. This is one side. And the second side, and there I want to reflect also a bit to one question in the chat, where we see that not only in Germany and the European Union, but also in the US, the UK, but also in some Asian nations, we see that some due diligence measures are taken up, and this is very important. I think it's a relatively logical process. We started from the carbon footprint of products and supply lines, and now we broaden the picture in a sense towards social and environmental aspects of sustainability. So this is rather the next step, I would say. So I would also see this process to continue, and at the same time, this would also be the right time to develop sector-specific templates to check how can we coordinate, how can we align specific reporting mechanisms, how can we pool information that can be used to be applied to certain regulations. So there I see also a high potential in cooperation in sectors, because specifically in the garment industry, we see that there is a long-term cooperation between brands and suppliers already. And on this basis, I believe that also due diligence efforts can be taken in a cooperative measure and not to be burdensome to either the brands or the supply line, but to duly implement the respective regulation.
Yeah. I think it's important to note here that, what you were saying, just whether you have a publicly controlled based approach or a civil liability approach, the reports are supposed to be a mean to a goal. The reports are not the goal. We're not reporting for the sake of reporting. We're reporting for the sake of control and accountability and, improving the due diligence in the sector. I think that can get lost at times, and there is the risk that it turns more into reporting for the sake of reporting. So thank you. That's very important to clarify, I think, at this point. I would encourage everyone to post some questions in the chat if you have a couple open ones. One question we've already managed to answer earlier, and then we have one question about the timeline. That one, maybe Lena, you could answer. The question was, because we were talking at that time in the session on the EU due diligence directive will need to get transposed into national laws. You were talking earlier a bit about the process. So you said, we're hoping that a position is agreed in November, ideally before March, otherwise elections make the process longer. Do we know what the time horizon is to then have applicable law in the national legislations that will then, the question says, be applied in the supply chain? I don't think they need to be applied in the supply chain. They need to be applied by the companies that fall under the European different national laws, but that will have consequences for the supply chain.
That's correct. So yeah, please excuse, I don't have the exact numbers at hand. I think I know them, but yeah. So I think it's also different. It differs from draft to draft. So I think for the Commission and the Council's draft, it says 2 years after the adoption of the directive, it has to be transposed into national law. So we think that by I'm not sure. So I think maybe like 2 years from next year, so maybe 2026. But then in the European Parliament, as I mentioned earlier in the draft, we have a lower scope of, or a wider scope of application, because the European Parliament says, okay, we can apply the directive to companies starting from 250 employees and a lower net worldwide turnover. And because of that fact, the European Parliament said, okay, for these companies, we will give them a bit more time to apply the directive. So it will be a different timeline for smaller companies. I don't know it by heart, but for the biggest companies, it will be applicable right from the start, like 2 years after adoption. And then for the smaller companies, it will maybe be like 3 years or 4 years.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think also what's important in this conversation then is that the laws are, at least in a European level, down the line. They are not there yet, but that doesn't mean that there's a lot of time to wait to implement changes at the moment. In some cases, we're talking about quite complex systems when we talk about complaints or remediation that need to be set up. We were also talking about like formats for stakeholder engagement, one of the things that Florian mentioned. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of time to waste to get these things going and started, because that's when things need to be in place, not when people need to be starting to put those in place. But maybe then that brings us already a bit to the support measures. I'd say, some of the support measures are things like the guidance that Florian mentioned, that BAFA now published, that clarifies people's questions. But another support measure is also that because there is that discrepancy between the laws apply and are only in scope for certain companies that are based in Europe, in Germany, in one of those markets, it does have consequences for the rest of the supply chain. So I would like to invite two of our speakers we have here in addition that I mentioned in the beginning, and one is Patrick from Vectra and the other one is Daniel from Adelphi, because we would like to invite you to just share a little bit of what you do in terms of supportive measures so that we can offer as much support to the supply chain as possible in getting to these processes. Before we get started with both of your inputs, though, I really enjoy moderating these sessions, but sometimes I'm basically having a bilateral conversation with our speakers at the moment because I'm looking at my screen and I can't see all of you participants at the same time. So I'd really love it if you take the time to quickly fill out some of the feedback form that we have. It's pretty short to do, but that just gives me a bit of a better understanding, are there any follow-up questions that we can discuss in any of the next sessions? I also saw that there are a couple more questions for the Q&A coming in, which is really good. I love that. So what I would suggest we do is you guys take a second to fill out the feedback. Then I'll hand over to Patrick and to Danielle to tell us a little bit more about the support measures. And then I just come back to the Q&A questions so that no question remains unanswered, or you at least all know who to address those questions to after today's session. So on that note, maybe Patrick, you want to go first? And I see a couple of people know you already in the call. That's good. It is a small world every now and then. I've noticed a lot of familiar faces in the call. But on that note, I would hand over to you. My colleague Hani would be sharing the slides, and then be very curious to hear what you're doing in this area.
Well, first, thank you very much for allowing us to speak. Much appreciated. I really enjoyed the conversation so far between the different experts. This is great. But I put myself in the shoes of a brand or a supplier. And while we're talking about Europe and the directive, and it might turn into 27 different legislations, we talked about Germany, what about also the rest of the world? I can see panic, right? So I guess on the next slide, what I would say is stop, take a deep breath, and let's not panic, right? I mean, we talked a lot about the different legal aspects of, what is being asked, reporting, etc. But in actual fact, this is not new, right? We have been doing a lot of it for the last decade, if not more. And this is a natural evolution, right? The whole thing started with self-regulation, where we had codes of conduct, we had audits, we had corrective action plans. And as a business, frankly, you are supposed to know, who you are interacting with. So if you're a brand, you need to know who are your suppliers and your supply chain. If you're a factory, you're supposed to know your factory and the suppliers to you. So what is happening worldwide is basically the shift from self-regulation to compliance, to regulation. And different countries have completely different approaches. So, if I look at, the next element on the slide, you will see that, we've got Norway that takes a particular approach that is particularly enforcement through the courts. We talked about Germany and France that is looking at reporting and accountability. We look at the United States that is looking at market access through Customs and Border Protection Agency. We also know Japan and New Zealand are putting in place legislations. Wow, so much different out there. But the reality is that they all follow the same principles, which is basically, as a brand, as a supply chain owner, you are supposed to know your supply chain. And based on that, you make the best decisions for you as a company. And as a factory, you know your factory and you are responsible for making the best decisions and compliance on your factory. Right. So there is a logic to it and it's not you. So let's start there first and foremost. On the next slide, I would say that, frankly, when you look at compliance, compliance is an interesting way to look at the world, but you are running businesses. And when you run a business, you have to look at business performance. You have to look at your own data, and you have to see, where you make the necessary decisions that are applicable for you as an organization in the way you run your business. And that drives performance, and good performance actually drives compliance. And based on the data that helps you drive your performance, that allows you to get to compliance, you also can report. Right? And I think that's, again, something to focus on. We come out of an audit and cap mechanism, but you can turn that around more into a performance mechanism where you look at data. And frankly, with all of the developments in technology, data is the lifeblood of everything, and this is just a slice of that. So, how do we support? What do we recommend to you? Frankly, we recommend on the next slide basically to keep it simple and focus on the way that you have managed your business over the last whatever history for you, and to build on what you know, to build on all of the self-regulation mechanisms that you have put in place, to then drive more data that allow you to drive more performance. And in order to do that, you should be thriving as a business. And a thriving business can be a force for good, and it can be, it can fulfill all of the requirements of reporting. For us, when we interact with anybody, it is critical that within the shortest period of time, you know how to navigate this forest of compliance, as I would call it right now. I was given 3 minutes and I did it in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. So I apologize for the additional 20 seconds. So sorry.
Oh, don't worry about that. I'm not that German that those 20 seconds bother me. Added value in the content, added value for the webinar. So thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing. I would also like to hand over to Daniel next, so that we can have two different perspectives on this, maybe similar perspectives. I'm very curious to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me today, and it was a very interesting event already. So I appreciate that. Just a quick introduction. Who am I, or who are we? Adelphi, maybe some of you know Adelphi. We're one of the leading think tanks in sustainability based in Berlin, Germany, and in Munich. We've been, I would say, in this field for more than 20 years, and it's actually exciting times for us because we just launched 2 days ago a new brand under our Adelphi umbrella. It's called Fiont, and it's actually focusing on what we are discussing today and a bit beyond that, mainly advising companies on their transformation pathway. Supply chain transformation is one element, of course, and then we have the decarbonization debate. We also learned today that you can also merge it, or we're about to merge these debates. So very exciting times. We can go to the next slides. What we do, and I would like to maybe a few remarks. We talk about the German supply chain law. We also learned there are various other laws, some like the French one, I would say equally comprehensive, the European one coming up. I would nevertheless say it's still very much an expert debate. I mean, we shouldn't assume that suppliers in international supply chains by nature know all the details of the law or are familiar with what we talk about, because we're already very, very nitty-gritty discussions, I would say, about the law, which is good, which is needed. But I would say, and that's our starting point, we also need to cover the basics and start. And I think Patrick said something in a similar way. Also use what is already available and further strengthen that, I would say. So we have a toolkit. We've developed a toolkit, also partly in use together with the GIZ, but also let's say aimed at brands and supply chains or suppliers directly. 3 elements. We have a 5-step guidance model that I go through briefly, but it's very much, let's say, reflecting the main elements of the German supply chain law, but also I would say the broader scheme behind it, let's say the UN guiding principles. So what is actually needed to have a good management approach when it comes to managing impacts in the supply chain, both from buyer and supplier perspective, I would say. We're using templates for suppliers. I know the GIZ, and we developed them with the GIZ, also has them, is using them. But our point is there is so much already available. Suppliers, international suppliers should use what is there, should learn from what has been developed. And the third element is we're actually going into the field, because what we see right now, and I think it's very logical, is it's very much process oriented, very much compliance oriented here in Germany for the German supply chain law. And many companies are making sure that either they're setting up processes or they're making sure they're aligned with what is needed or what is requested in the law. But eventually, I think the law, and I think that also everybody mentioned it today, it's not about ticking boxes or reporting, but it's really transforming supply chains for the better and to make them more sustainable. So what we do is actually we say, okay, we have a paper-based approach, we have templates, but then we go in these supply chains, and we have a workshop format where we do that with suppliers. Maybe next slide. I just a few examples. Basically, we say, okay, there are 5 main steps that reflect the German supply chain law, what is needed, for example, like setting up a policy or a broader understanding, then the risk analysis, taking measures, reporting, and also how to deal with grievances or complaints. What we always do, and it's kind of like a checklist approach, we basically ask questions, and we always start where companies are at and what they have readily available, and then we develop it further so that suppliers ideally are more familiar with what the law requires, but also are familiar with what they can already use or further develop. That's the main idea behind this guidance model. And we've tested it various times, and it's actually working quite well, I would say, to really pick up what suppliers have, put it into context, and then develop it further. And I know also Florian from the BAFA said, and there's a clear guideline: suppliers shouldn't be the responsibility lies with the companies that lie in the scope of the law. I would nevertheless say, and it's totally true, of course, but it's also in the interest of suppliers, what Patrick just said, that to improve their performance, and it will be in their own benefit, but we should really make it or start it in a very reasonable approach and start where they are. Another example, risk. Next slide, please. When it comes to performing a risk analysis, I know the German law doesn't require suppliers to do that on their own, but nevertheless, I would say it makes a lot of sense to reflect on your own risk profile, and we have a very good overview of available data, for example, country-specific data, sectoral-specific data, raw material related data, so that it's relatively, I would not say easy, but doable to come up with the first abstract risk profile for a company, and the company can use it also not only to, let's say, share information with a buyer or a brand, but also be more confident when it comes to buyer requests and questions, because they're already familiar with what, let's say, the viewpoint of buyers are and where maybe a request is reasonable or not. Next slide. I would skip that because it's another slide on the guidance model, and come to the next one because I think I'm already behind a bit. So this is basically how we proceed. It's always based on checklists. Of course, there is more information behind it, but we wanted to make it very clear for suppliers and the brands. Next slide. To give you one example, this is actually from the SME Compass of the GIZ and the help desk here in Germany. We helped develop that. It's let's say a template for a policy statement that also suppliers can use to understand how, let's say, the brands are looking at policies, and they can easily adjust that to their own needs. So what I just said at the beginning, lots of good material is readily available. We just have to present it and put it into use. Next slide, please. Last example, it's a project we carried out with the GIZ in Pakistan this summer. We actually conducted workshops on the German supply chain law with various companies. And what I said at the beginning, we shouldn't assume, and I think rightly so, that everybody, when we say, do we know the German Supply Chain Act, that people are raising their hands and say, yes, I've studied it in detail. No, it's very natural that we should really start introducing the law, what the intention was. I think Florian outlined that very well, what it's really about. And then we should, what we do with the guidance model, the templates, and then the on-site workshop, really onboard them onto what is needed. And I would also share what Patrick said. Many things are available. And on an interesting side note, and I've put that in these post-its, the yellow post-its, we also learn what they think should be improved on our side. For example, how do we manage the multiple requests from buyers or brands? How do we deal with maybe unjustified requests on the brand side? Is there any kind of help available? How can we pool resources? How can top management support be ensured? So many also on a side note, many good feedback we receive in these workshops, and that's our approach. So guidance model, templates, and workshop on the ground to help implement the law.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks to the both of you for joining us here today. I'm hoping that a couple of the questions we had in the chat, like, where do I get started with, or what would be applicable for me? It became clearer that that's not sort of a one-sentence answer that I can give to every potential person in the room, but this is something that there is support out there on how to find that out specifically and how to get started. I would like to stress again that both the directive that's being planned right now as well as the existing laws do not have the manufacturer, unless they are huge manufacturers there may be individual cases where that applies as well. I think most companies do not have the number of employees in Europe that comes, or the net turnover in Europe that comes with falling under the direct scope of the laws and the laws planned. So if those laws apply to you, they apply to you because the client you are producing for, you are producing with, falls under the scope of that law. So it also depends what needs to change, depends on the risk assessment and the risk needs and the approach that that client takes. And then hopefully that's a collaborative effort jointly together. There was one or two questions, though, that I would like to forward to our speakers. One, and I don't know which one of you would like to answer that, and I would also invite Patrick or Danielle to, if you want to answer that one, feel free to raise your hand too. I think became very clear from your presentations that we have great expertise in the room, so I'm going to use it all. One question that was in the chat was, there is not just legislation coming up in Europe, the US, the UK, sort of the more Western countries, but also across the regions. And what kind of cooperation could there be between countries to then align that, to harmonize that, and to make sure there's more of a unified approach to that if we talk outside of European developments, which tend to be harmonized across the European region? Does anyone feel inclined to answer that question? Just raise your hand, and then Hani would put you up on the screen next to me. Yes, Lena.
Thank you. Maybe I can just start, and someone else can then jump in and add to that. I think so. From my point of view, yes, that's an important question because there's more and more legislature arising around the globe. But at the same time, what we do see is that they all are based, and that goes into the direction what Patrick said, it all goes back to the OECD guidelines or the UN guiding principles. So the UN guiding principles asked the UN countries to develop a national action plan, which is how the German supply chain law came to be. And this is a process that is being implemented around the globe. Like, for example, I know from Peru that they developed a national action plan, which will eventually maybe result in a law. So the idea is that it should all not be that different. But I understand where your question is coming from, because oftentimes, of course, for the companies, the difficulties lie within the nitty-gritty, then the reporting requirements, etc. So I do agree this should be talked about and this should be agreed upon. One important point I'd like to raise in that context is that there is a forum like the United Nations. There's also a separate process, which is the UN treaty process, which has been going on for a while, which was initiated by Ecuador, I think, where the UN states, basically all the countries in the world, they sit together and they talk about how a UN treaty regarding due diligence could look like, how they could transpose the UN guiding principles into a universal treaty. So I think that's also one important instrument to align the different movements or the different laws that come into place around the globe.
Thank you, Lena. Thanks for sharing that. Would any of the other speakers like to answer that question on how to harmonize, bring together the different developments also with countries outside of Europe and the US at the moment? No? Okay.
Daniel from Adelphi.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know why I didn't see those hands. Yeah, Daniel.
No problem. I just wanted to second what Lena just said. The OECD guidelines, they have just recently been updated. And I mean, they're broader than the European Union. They're, I think, covering 51 countries, the guidelines for multinational enterprises I refer to. And actually, I would say we conducted a short study. They have an impact on, they already had on country-specific legislation. That's one thing. So I think they are very important. I would really stress their relevance. And what they also do, for example, they expanded the environmental due diligence part. And I think in a way, it maybe is also an outlook to what will be, let's say, the legal standard in a few years. It goes well beyond the German law. I mean, topic-wise, and I would say the OECD work is highly relevant, both on a, I would say, sector agnostic level, but also for specific sectors. I think they're very good guidance. I mean, for example, textile sector, and so I would stress them, and a very good opportunity to tie it together, I would say.
Thanks, Daniel. Patrick, do you want to add something to that as well?
Yes, if possible. I think I've got 3 points. I think one, as Daniel already mentioned, I think, federations and sector initiatives are absolutely critical, and that they can actually help influence local and regional government. So clearly work with your federations and associations would be one strong recommendation that I would have to everybody out there. The second, of course, is that there is good news, right? I mean, there is a bit of excitement around all of this due diligence legislation popping up everywhere. And as, there is, a little bit of, wow, look at this forest growing really fast. There are also UN organizations that are having exactly the same reaction. So I know from direct interaction with the International Labour Organization that they too are taking initiatives to harmonize some of the upcoming legislation. So for example, there is the work that they do in South America, where ILO is working with 9 South American countries to harmonize due diligence legislation based on the European proposal at the moment. So there is a little bit of good news also from a UN and an OECD point of view. And I think third, again, making it super practical. do not get distracted with enforcement, right? Because enforcement is very specific to the jurisdiction, and reporting is a result of available data. It is just in different formats. So rather than focusing on enforcement, rather than focusing on reporting, focus on the core data that is needed for you to manage what you need to do, and that data will allow you to report.
Thank you for sharing that, Patrick. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I feel like we haven't necessarily stuck on just accountability for the whole time, because obviously, you know, in order to know how to hold people accountable, we need to really look at who's being held accountable. We are, in this case, talking about some laws or directives that are not fully there yet. They are not fully developed. Then we have the difference between those who fall under the directives and laws directly, those who get impacted through maybe longer supply chain processes. I think one aspect that has also become very clear is that there is very different levels of understanding on this. One of you also mentioned that, you know, not everyone puts up their hand if it's like, oh, hey, German supply chain, it's that. That's also, I think, just part of the conversation. So I think building those support structures and, you know, like these kinds of webinars like we have today are hopefully a starting point for some of you to feel more comfortable in that topic and to get access to that knowledge. In a couple of countries, there are also the responsible business hubs. So just have a look at your respective country, responsible business hub in Cambodia, responsible business hub in Vietnam. They are also places for you to get more information, to get more support on these issues. Hani, it would be great if you could just put all of the speakers we had today on the stage one last time. Thank you. And I would just like to thank all of you for joining us today and for taking the time. I hope all of you have a productive day after, and also thank you for all of the participants who've joined us here today. One of the next sessions, we're going to be talking about stricter waste regulations, because we also want to look at individual laws and not just sort of the overall developments behind that on the 15th of November. And on that note, I would just like to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you, Florian, Saj, Lena. You're changing orders while I'm speaking. This is not helpful for me. Thank you. Let me start again. Thank you, Patrick, Daniel, Saj, Lena, and Florian. I had a great time moderating this today, so thank you so much for joining. I hope you all had a productive session, and would love to welcome you all again in one of our Moving the Needle webinars. So thank you so much, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
See you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Stay safe.